Welcome, everyone. It's terrific to see so many faces coming out in such brutal weather for this event. I'm Johnny Lewandowski. I'm here on behalf of Political Quarterly, which I hope some of you know. It is a progressive journal about contemporary politics whose founders, funders, editors, and original publishers included variously Bernard Shaw, Leonard and Virginia Woolf, both Webbs, Alasky, and Robson. So it has a kind of credible history. It's almost 100 years old, and for all of those years, we've tried to make sense of developments in politics from a progressive standpoint. And here's the killer, in clear and well-written, accessible prose. And we try to bring together experts and practitioners with a range of views and a range of opinions to write clearly about topics we think to be important. And policing today is one obvious such topic. So we are about to publish a special collection on contemporary policing, edited by Professor Emmeline Taylor at City University, Ben Bradford at UCL, and John Jackson at LSE. And many of the authors who are campaigners, practitioners, and academics are here in the audience tonight. They've written on topics ranging from the role of women inside the police force to wider issues of institutional culture, governance, arming, and funding. We're proud of what we do, and we're especially proud that Jewel has agreed for us to co-sponsor this evening's event as part of our promotion of that special collection and as part of our progressive project. So that's me. Welcome again. I'm now introducing Caitlin Schmidt, who is going to tell us something about what we know about violence to women and girls.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here and present to you the findings from a newly launched report that I wrote with Hannah Fernside and Nadia Rohrecker on reviewing the data landscape on violence against women and girls. This report is the first in a series that we are writing as part of a wider project at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, developing a UK Gender Equality Index. An index brings together multiple indicators to measure a certain thing. We want to measure and map gender equality levels across the UK, and we want to do so by combining existing data for local authorities for each nation in the UK. This will provide us with a benchmarking tool for research, advocacy, and policy making, and we will be visualizing the findings on a user-friendly website that might look something like this. So it covers 374 local authority districts across all 4 UK nations. Now, how do we measure gender equality? The dimensions we will be looking at are paid work, unpaid work, money, education, health, and power and participation. But of course, violence against women and girls is one of the most extreme causes and consequences of gender inequality. For this reason, we wanted to include a domain that is separate from the core index. And to do so, we had to understand what are the forms of violence against women and girls, and we did so by reviewing UK government policy as well as international treaties that the UK is party to identify 4 forms of violence: physical violence, psychological violence, sexual violence, and honor-based violence. We took these categories to then review the ready available data and to see how well we can measure these 4 forms of violence. What we found were that the data sets covering all 4 UK nations with consistent definitions barely exist. Further, data are rarely measured on the subnational level, so on the regional or local authority level. And then finally, data are infrequently disaggregated by protected characteristics other than sex, if that. And this is a particular challenge given the intersectional nature of violence against women and girls. These limitations pose significant challenges for us to include a domain of violence against women and girls for our index. We do, however, put forward recommendations that we hope will contribute to changing the data landscape in the UK, even though it is quite a rich data landscape that we have generally. We think it needs improvement And we would like to see government, statistical, and public sector agencies working with women's organizations and experts in the field to achieve conceptual and methodological consistency in measurement. Further, we would like to see government and statistical agencies collect comparable data on violence that are disaggregated by multiple characteristics covering all 4 UK nations and ideally on the subnational level. Then, more broadly, we would like to see a government implementation of a coordinated community response. This has been called for by the National Charity Standing Together and other sector organisations, in which agencies such as housing, health, social care, education, criminal justice, debt advice organisations come together to share responsibility in tackling this issue. And we would like to extend this response to also include statistical agencies. Then finally, as highlighted by the Joint Sector Manifesto, we would also like to see data sharing restrictions being introduced so that statutory services and home offices don't share data necessarily when it comes to insecure or people with insecure immigration status, so that they can access support and be free from violence without fear of immigration enforcement. Now, I'm very excited for this stellar panel to share their expertise, and I would like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Local level.
Thank you.
But not yet. So when you say local authority, you don't mean local. You mean it's local.
Well, thank you very much to Caitlin and to the team that's done the work on the violence against women and girls data. As you can see, it's a pretty bleak picture for those of us who are seeking to understand at a local level what is going on. And of course, that is incredibly important for policy making. We're going to talk about that, but talk more broadly with what is a stellar panel. Caitlin's used exactly the right adjective. And what I'm going to do is invite each panellist into the conversation to share their perspectives, and then we're going to have some cross-panel conversation, and then ultimately we'll go out to you for some questions. So thank you all for joining us on what, particularly by Australian standards, is not an easy weather set of circumstances out there. I do look at my phone every day to try and work out what the temperature in Adelaide is going to be on that day. I won't depress you by sharing it right now. I'm going to invite into the conversation first Baroness Louise Casey. Louise is the sort of superhero public policy person in the UK when governments are in difficulties. You know, the light goes into the sky, the neon phone rings, and she swoops in and responds.
And says it's shit. Anyway. You fucked up and it's shit. That's basically, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sorry, Julia.
It's only a matter of time till she joins the Marvel universe and we're able to watch a movie. But Baroness Casey's, one of her most recent inquiries has been into the Met Police. And against that backdrop, Louise, how do we restore trust?
So I think the first thing to say is, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for everybody turning out this evening, and given the weather. That's presumably why, Rosie, you put drinks on first. So we've got a lively audience, which is great. And thank you very much for the work that you've done. Just on that, and it will be part of how you restore trust, is people's openness to understanding what's directly happening in their area, and the more local and connected you are, the more likely you are to trust it. So if you just go back to the early days of, and there are people in the room that will remember this, not looking at you, Betsy, that people that remember this, that in fact we worked with Ipsos Mori in those days, where actually on crime, if you just gave people where they should contact, when they contact, you tell them that you've heard them, you reflect back to them what the problem is, and you tell them you've done something about it, it kind of works. No shit, Sherlock. Sorry, I can't help myself. Come on, it's Thursday evening. It's pissing with rain out there, and even in the darkness, we've always got to find some fun to be had. And so I think there's something really important as well, that I think that we can get a lot of data in other areas of our lives, right? And it may not be ideal, but we can pretty much, if you look at the revolution, and Ofsted goes like that as to whether it's too tough or too soft or too this or too that, and people like and dislike league tables, but there are league tables in health, so we can tap into something and work out how long our waiting list is. And again, it's not ideal, but we can get information about our various things that we might care about. You can't get it on crime. Can't get it on crime. Crime's like, well, why should you want to know what's going on? We're in charge, and the less you know, the better you'll be. So there's a really interesting out-of-step thing, I think, about the British institutions, both of police and the courts and the justice system more generally, which is like, we know better is the other thing. I think there's a real cultural, we know better than you, and of course, on the whole, forgive me, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. You're very welcome here. We need these audiences to be dominated by decent men, because you have an Exocet missile that we don't have as women, to do good in a way which we won't be able to do as good as effectively because we're not men, and therefore we can't be role models. I think that the problem is that that actually the serious side of that is that it means that people who run that system, who are largely men, think it's an affront to be accountable. And of course, if you're living in a world where actually women aren't equal to men anyway, and if you add into that women of colour who are even less equal and treated even more in a more challenged way, you start to see yourself a pattern. So the reason I have been from the get-go an absolute unreserved supporter of this institute is because I, and some people in the audience, often dealing with the end of when actually gender inequality actually plays out in the worst aspects. And some of those worst aspects were writ large in the Metropolitan Police. And I was in there for 14 months. It took far longer, as colleagues know, than I thought it was going to take. They were significantly more in denial than anticipated. I did myself think that I found it extraordinary on arrival, and even in the commissioning of it, that if Sarah Everard's murderer, it's just like, it was extraordinary, the level of the fact he was a serving police officer. That's what marks him out as different. And on top of that, because other people do, sadly, what Sarah Everard's murderer has done, but they're rarely police officers. We rarely give them guns. We rarely let them carry warrant cards. And we also know that he had a track record in doing things that would tell any of us in the room, without having to work that hard, that he was at least dodgy, if not worse. And it's bookended. In the middle of it, I got to know Reverend Smallman, who is a black woman, and her two girls, or women as they were also women of colour. And this extraordinary case, really, everybody talks about the WhatsApp group and the photographs of her daughters. What I think about in relation to that case is that I know, deep inside me, that if they'd been white women, and probably middle-class white women, if we'd been in Hampstead with white women rather than where we were, the police might have gone and looked for those women because it was so shocking for them not to go home. They were in a park, it was a nice night, they were having some drinks, they were sisters, and it was really unusual for them not to come home. And I can't help but ask myself that that is an example of institutional, systemic or organisational racism as well as sexism, misogyny, because my starting point in those cases, if you look at the data, and I'll come to denial and how data and evidence is the way to deal with denial and calling it out. But I found it really striking that the more I looked at that case and started to compare statistics and analysis of who is searched for and when they're searched for, if a girl, sorry, I'm old, I can say the word girl, if a girl is running away from a children's home at the age of 14 or 15 and she runs 31 times in something like 3 or 4 days, she's barely in there. And yet we can still call her wayward. And the other thing, just whilst I'm on that type of area, one of the things I took, so interesting, I went at one point, interesting is a euphemism for an extremely difficult job, is I went to Rotherham and did the first and only use of the inspection powers the government have to look at child sexual exploitation in Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council. I came out of that. They had, on arrival, I started looking at how they spent some of their money, always an interesting thing to do. And I realised that they were spending more money on training social workers to deal with Ofsted and the child inspections. They'd had 33 different inspections into children's services, I think in a 3 or 4 year period. They'd all come out as poor or inadequate. And so instead of dealing with what was going on, they spent money on training for social workers so that they'd be able to better deal with inspectors. And they spent more money in that than they did on their child sexual exploitation team. And in a way that tells you a couple of things. It tells you how institutions can screw up. These are good people. Most people that work in the public sector, we don't get up in the morning to actually make the world a worse place. Most of us aren't the likes of people that are nasty and difficult and don't care. But if you're not understanding about structural disadvantage or misogyny or racism and understanding what that looks like and how to find it, then you won't find it and you won't change it. And therefore, on that, I came out of Rotherham and I remember then coming back home and somebody saying, God, we've just got the Metropolitan Police, this was 2016, had their inspectorate, HMIC or whatever it's called, had done an inspectorate into their child abuse and children's services. This is 2016, guys. And the inspectorate went back, and it was terrible, absolutely terrible. Everybody, oh Christ, how will the mayor deal with it, all that usual malarkey. And I went through and I thought, oh my God, have they not read the Rotherham review? Is anybody paying attention to, I know it's Yorkshire, but you're not beyond it down here in London, mate. Anyway, I go back, I looked at every single inspection report on child abuse in relation to the Metropolitan Police, and do you know what had changed? Not the services, not the facts, nothing. The inspectorate had gone soft. So what the inspector had done is it started to say things like they're working really hard to collect the information they need to change something. I worked in the civil service for a long time. I know how to do lines to take when you're doing absolutely nothing, but you need to find a line to take so the minister doesn't look like, they specialise in looking like dicks nowadays. But anyway, it's great, isn't it? I don't work for one anymore, so I can say whatever I want, and I can break any code I like as well. At Wooding Tyne, I've been, hung up for breaking a civil service code for using the word dick in public. But anyway, I've just done it again. Just for the hell of it, Julia. And so what I'm trying to say is what is really interesting is, of course, these things about women's experience of the justice system. How can we restore trust? We can restore trust when we start with understanding about the disadvantage that exists in society already, that we start understanding the responsibility incumbent on everyone to do something about it. And if you can't name it, you can't do something about it. And I thought the really interesting thing is, and I've got colleagues here from Operation Soteria, which is one of the most outstanding pieces of evidence-led policy, research and putting into action I have ever seen in the area of violence against women and girls. And I hope you don't mind me saying it, guys, but it was very interesting coming in as a reviewer to see how the Metropolitan Police found that too difficult to hear and deal with. And so if we're going to restore trust, then we have to find a way to open up people's minds to listening to evidence, and to listening to the voices, particularly of women, and I would say other disadvantaged and disempowered groups within that. I live in a city that I utterly adore. I love London. It gave me everything. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't made it to London. I made it to London. And I'm so proud of our city. We're an extraordinary city, and we're over 50% not white. And the experience of black people in London is just appalling. You're 52% more likely to be disciplined if you're a black police officer. On women, let's take this one. These guys know this, blow your mind. I mean, just like, surely you can see this is crazy. If a police officer perpetrated domestic violence, is no further actioned in 84% of all cases. Like, you're all in this world. Even if you weren't in this world, would you honestly think that statistic made sense? 84% no further actioned? 84%. This is a profession that we give because we need to give them huge powers. I give them the powers to stop me, to search me, to cuff me, particularly if I'm black, I'm going to be cuffed when I'm searched, to then be put in a van or a police car and taken back to a police cell. I'm lucky if they strip search me in the police cell rather than somewhere else. And when we say strip search, it's horrible. Most police officers don't like doing it. It's inhuman and degrading, and it's sometimes used as a technique to actually make people feel degraded. I then can keep them in that police cell for 24 hours on one officer's word. Now, I'll stand by that word if I think they're decent people doing the right thing. And if I think the Met and all the other police forces have got the right systems in place to manage themselves and manage others. Carrick, who in my mind, my review was bookended by Sarah Everard's murderer and Carrick, who is the most prolific multiple sadist and rapist that's been in a uniform probably ever, I think it would be fair to say. 12 convictions of rape, and there's a 13th woman, and there are probably more. We had him 19 times in their misconduct and public complaints system. We didn't know who he was and what his name was, but we looked for people that were in their public complaints, who had had allegations made against them and who were in the misconduct system. And we found him 19 times in the Met's misconduct system. They didn't. So if you're going to restore trust in the police, you've got to tell somebody like me that you're actually able to use your systems. And also, he had 2 offences before he came in. So he was vetted and had 2 offences. He committed a further 2 offences whilst he was on probation. We then gave him a gun and various other things. He then was re-vetted 6 years later. And part of his do the right thing is also be efficient. I mean, there's just an extraordinary level of inefficiency and incompetence. 6 years later, instead of connecting the fact he'd had all these multiple complaints and misconduct allegations made against him, he said that he got 3 points in his driving licence, and that's the only thing that was on his record at that point. He went on to drag a woman out of a flat by her neck down a staircase, and his male partner that was with him made a complaint. That complaint was like, leave it made. And the woman, of course, who'd made the complaint was so terrified she withdrew that complaint. So he went on, because of those of you that know this world know that they escalate. I heard somebody the other day, it was that nice BBC correspondent refer to flashing on the news. And I thought, you know, I was born in 1965. Flashing's a word that might have been used in my day. Nowadays, it's called exposure. It's you're revealing yourself for a reason, and if we don't stop you, you'll go further up the chain. But the police don't look to themselves in the same way. I believe the police have to use their powers. I believe actually in some stop and search, but the inequality in it and the inhumanity, I think, in it will be the block to trust.
Thank you, Louise. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Hanana Siddiqui, who's here sitting alongside me, who is an expert in research and in policy and advocacy. And I want you to also respond to the question, how do we restore trust? And you might want to reflect on some of the themes that Louise has raised.
I think she said it. I was recently asked to look at some awards for police officers, and was sort of, in a dilemma about whether or not we should do that as South or Black sisters, because, we don't have trust and confidence in the police, but we do want to reward good practice. We know that report after report comes out with problems with policing, and good practice tend to be in small pockets, and you do want to encourage that. But at the same time, we felt that we couldn't be part of the award ceremony or be a part of the panel that decides on the awards because of the way that the Met Police refused to accept institutionalized racism and misogyny and homophobia in the police force when you did your report. The failure to acknowledge institutionalized forms and structural inequalities are one of the big problems that we feel that unless we address those problems, we're not going to be able to restore trust or confidence in the police or actually deal with the problems we're dealing with. In a lot of our work, we're having to deal with a lot of over-policing and under-policing. And I'll explain what I mean by under-policing, but the over-policing is obviously some blatant forms of racism, which is in part in things like stop and search, the inequalities and discrimination that takes place. Obviously, you also, people are arguing for stop and search to some extent because you want to be able to deal with knife crime and on all those issues as well. But we know that the way that it's been disproportionately applied to Black men and how that has been discriminatory practice. In terms of the over-policing, I think one good example for us at South of Black Sisters, we deal with women from Black and minority communities who face domestic abuse, forced marriage, honor-based violence, and other harmful practices. Sorry, I've just seen someone I think I recognize, but I'm not, although I just got distracted a little bit because it's been such a long time. But I don't think so. I think it's right. I'm making a mistake. So with the over-policing is migrant women. We deal a lot with women from insecure immigration status. You talked about how data sharing between the police and immigration enforcement prevents a lot of women from who are undocumented or even who are not sure of their status or maybe even have status and still have been told by their perpetrators that they will be deported, they'll be detained and deported by the police, that the police are not going to help them because they're a migrant in this country. And these are women who are facing domestic abuse within the home and feel that they can't go and report to the police domestic abuse in order to get protection from domestic abuse because they're often seen as immigration offenders before that they're seen as victims of domestic abuse. And David Carrick was one of the high-profile cases where in one of the cases he did exploit a Brazilian woman who had an insecure immigration status and told her that if she goes to the police, they're not going to, they are going to deport her. He didn't have to say that to her. He already had power over her. He was a police officer. He was very much in charge and in control, but he used her immigration status in order to control her even further and to prevent her from seeking help. And this is a routine problem that we have with many cases, mainly because of the hostile environment that migrant women are facing. So that is a form of some over-policing at times, which prevents women from seeking help. Under-policing would be where women, and this is in relation to the grooming gangs as well, is where women don't get help from within Black and minority communities from the police because the police are trying to be culturally sensitive or religiously sensitive. To give you an example, the case of Banaz Mahmood, for example, is of a young woman who was killed in a so-called honor killing by her father and uncle and 5 male cousins. In fact, there were 7 men involved in her killing, as well as the wider community. In fact, in the wider community, there was about 50 men within the community who were involved somehow in the crime or in the cover-up of the crime. And she went to the police 5 times before she was killed in order to seek help from the police. Now, this is also another little problem about how do you show racism, because not all of it's very blatant and it's not very clear. You know it's there, the subtle strands are there. You wonder why the police didn't intervene, why they were just ignoring the abuse, did not taking domestic abuse seriously, or was it because she was trying to talk about honor-based violence, or that she was from a minority community and they will feel that they didn't want to seem to be interfering in minority cultures in order to be culturally sensitive. Based on these multicultural notions that, you know, you don't intervene in minority cultures because they're self-governing and they resolve their own problems internally. So I think that often it's really hard to prove things like racism and misogyny. You know it's there, but it's really hard to evidence it, and evidence is what you need. So you can talk about it in terms of your experience as an organization and how it disproportionately affects women from minority communities, and how, you know, there is that same level of intervention that you would want in order to protect women from minority communities. And you talked about Biba Henry and Nicole Spellman. And again, that was, you know, another high-profile case where we know that not only was there misogyny in that case, but also racism in the way the police officers took those photographs in a context when they made very racist and sexist comments and shared that in their social media. So I think, you know, for me, you know, trust and confidence only comes with not only dealing with problems around over-policing, but also around under-policing. And people don't obviously understand, sometimes people don't understand what we mean by under-policing or cultural relativist approaches, because they think that, well, actually, you know, that multiculturalism is very much about promoting racial harmony. And it has, you know, a laudable aim to promote racial harmony. But unfortunately, with under multiculturalism, minority groups within communities, like women and other groups without power within those communities, don't get the protection that they need.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call now on Lady Edwina Grosvenor, and we're going to shift from talking about policing to talking about the prison system, which is your special area of expertise. And I was going to say passion, and then it sounds quite odd to say that someone's passion is the prison system. But you've done years and years of work, analytical and philanthropic, to try to get us to see the prison system differently. Are these issues of trust playing out there too?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 big issues at play. One which was highlighted so well, through the Institute, but through the research, which is the data doesn't really exist, which is why it's so great that you guys are where you are. When it comes to women in prison, you know, talk about these hidden worlds or the sort of murky world of justice and behind these closed doors, and then you take a prison. And, you know, it's 20 or so years ago when I started working in prisons, it was pretty difficult to get into prisons. It's even harder now. And things are much worse today in the prison system than they've ever been. They're more violent. The self-harm is worse. The suicide is worse. Staff retention is worse. I mean, everything across the board is a lot worse, which is kind of depressing when you've worked as a philanthropist in an area for over 20 years. And that's where we are. But so the data is so important. Women only make up, we know, 4% of the prison population. So there's around 3,500 women in prison compared to the sort of 85,000 men. And I remember my organisation, One Small Thing, being at a joint committee on human rights, and we took someone along to take evidence. And soon after we'd given ours, the prisons minister at the time, who shall remain nameless, was asked about how many pregnant women there were in prison. And he said, well, we don't know because we don't count. And, you know, we knew that, but it's like, it wouldn't be difficult. Of course, you wouldn't be able to catch every pregnant woman, because some of them come in and they don't know they're pregnant, but there's only 12 women's prisons. You could ask each governor, how many pregnant women are there in your prison that you know of? You know, this stuff isn't rocket science. So what does it say? If we're writing policies, laws are being made in the Houses of Parliament on no data. It's not good for the men either, but it's particularly bad when it comes to the women. And that's an appalling place to be, to know that policy and legislation is being drawn up on no data. There's a stat around children being removed from their mothers because women are usually the primary carers. So when they get put in prison, children are disproportionately affected. And people say to me, well, Edwina, you know that men are dads too. And I say, yes, of course, I know that. But they're not usually the primary carer. So when they go to prison, the women are usually keeping the home, the children are going to school. And, you know, again, we're generalizing, but that's the usual picture. But there's no systematic way of counting those children. It's simply not done. So the data is so crucially important. That is one way of restoring trust, I think. The other point I'd make on restoring trust is accountability. Because in prisons, you know, something happens, you know, maybe to a woman or to a man. Is that prison officer held accountable? Well, usually the answer is no. You know, a governor, let's take Liverpool prison, for example, a big male prison, that went up in smoke. They actually had to bring an incredible woman in called Pia Sinner, who's now the director of the Prison Reform Trust. She had to go in and take that prison over because the windows were broken, there were cockroaches everywhere, the men weren't coming out of their cells, and she had to turn it around. But what happened to that governor? He either got moved sideways or promoted, because that's usually what happens in the Ministry of Justice. You know, that in, again, 20 years of working in prisons, I've seen that happen quite a lot. That is unacceptable. How is anyone meant to have any trust when you see those types of things happening? And sadly, it is still happening. And when the Chief Inspector of Prisons says, this prison is not functioning, and then they come back again and they go, well, it's still not functioning properly. There's an urgent notification requirement. Well, it's still not functioning. And then what? So how is anyone meant to have any trust in these systems?
And can you just talk a little bit about the alternate models you've been working on with your philanthropy? I mean, there is a different way, isn't there?
Yeah, so in order to keep my own sanity, and having banged my head against a brick wall and sort of done lots of work in the prison system, which I do love, and there's some brilliant prison officers, some of the best people I've ever met work in prisons. And but I thought, gosh, I think I might go insane if I don't actually put my efforts and my money and my expertise into building perhaps my own system, which makes me sound a bit like a sort of dictator. But I thought I can build my own system and then I won't be answerable to anybody else. So I advised the government for 5 years on the reforms of the female prison estate. The Female Offender Strategy was published in June 2018. One of the recommendations was we need to build places in the community for women. And this is a really key point, because this isn't about treating women preferentially. This is about building systems that work. They need to work for the men, but they need to work for the women too. So I sat down and thought, right, if money was no issue, if politics was no issue, how would you design the best thing in the community so that women could get a community sentence? Because the problem that we have is a magistrate will have a woman in front of them and say, I need to give you a community sentence. What's your address? Well, I don't have an address because I'm homeless. Right, well, very sadly, I'm going to have to send you to prison because that safe address does not exist in this county. But then the magistrate might say, well, I want to give you a community sentence. What's your address? Well, my address is this, but my abuser's in my home. So the magistrate's like, well, I'm not going to give you home detention curfew if I think you're going to be murdered. So you have this dysfunction in the system where those women end up in prison because there is no safe place in the community. And that disproportionately affects the women. So I was like, right, when I did my business plan, when I looked at Hampshire, there were 6 safe beds for women in the county, but some of them were in approved premises with other men. And of course, the vulnerable women get preyed on by the men, so they're not particularly safe, and the women can't go with their children. So I set about, we mined the data out of Hampshire, and we did that through the police custody suites and through probation and just through the relationships that we had. The Ministry of Justice said, that data's amazing, how did you get it? I was like, we just went out and got it because you weren't very helpful. And of course, then with that data, we built, but you shouldn't build if you don't have the data. So it was the best data that we could get, and we have now we designed and built and have opened Hope Street. It's named after Hope Street in Liverpool for various reasons. And women can come to us on remand, because 60% of women who go to prison on remand are found not guilty, by which point they lose their home, their job, their children if they have them. then what? Thank you very much. So they can come to us on remand if appropriate. They can be sentenced to us if appropriate. They can come to us from prison if they're eligible for early release, and they can also come to us on the community probation contract. So the idea is, and I think at the beginning of your research you talked about methodological consistency. Gosh, that's a mouthful. And the methodology of Hope Street has been designed to be replicable and scalable. So you can take that model out of Hampshire, and the probation understands how it works, judiciary understands how it works, the police understands how it works, and of course the external agencies and third sector organisations that then feed into the work that should be done. But of course it's about health, it's about housing. When health and housing goes wrong, of course it becomes a criminal justice problem. So we've framed Hope Street as a housing and health problem, and our narrative and our language does not talk about the criminal, it doesn't talk about prison, and that's not to be disingenuous, but it's trying to push the narrative back to where it needs to be. You know, these problems start in the community and they will be fixed in the community. But it is so important that we're designing systems for the people in front of us. So the systems that will fit men, and a different system that will fit the women and usually their dependent children.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Vonda Viporska, who is also very expert in this area. She's the former CEO of the Black Equity Organisation. We've had a lot of content so far, but what is your perspective on how we restore the trust?
Thank you. Well, I spent 2 hours coming down from Preston this morning writing down what I was going to say, and then it's been such a rich discussion that I've made more notes as I've gone along, so I probably could go on for several hours, but I won't. It's always fascinating as an academic, although my subject was early modern Polish witchcraft, which is kind of criminal and women, so we're just kind of, you know, let me just say, there's nothing.
I'm happy to divert if there's we wouldn't mind leaving with a few good spells.
If I could fix that, I would have fixed a lot of things. But, I mean, you know, there's nothing here we haven't seen for centuries, basically, is the historian's point of view always. It's always a good get out. It's really interesting because as an academic and as a campaigner, you know, what I always wish for is an audience that is far more mixed. Because wonderful as academic research is, if it's not getting out there to the front line and to the campaigning organisations, I have to say that, you know, the revolution does not come through a good policy paper. You know, I'm really sorry to say that, but, you know, we need so much more. We need everybody working together. So my plea is really work together with the third sector, work together with the organisations, because they need the research as well. So that's my big plea. I think looking at that piece of research, it really struck me that, for me, racism is a form of violence. We know about weathering, we know the effect of racism on our lives and how, you know, we see more and more research saying it actually takes years off our lives. The things we have to go through, the economic effects of racism, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I really actually want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Baroness Casey, because we, as Black people, are the canary in the coal mine, because we've been saying this for decades. You know, we've been saying this since 15 young people died in a fire. We've been saying this since the 50s and the 60s. We've been saying this for decades. And it was only really when we had that intersectional approach where you said, this is happening to women, this is happening to people of colour, this is happening to gay and lesbian people, that we finally had that chance to say, why can't we work together on this? And this is what we started to do when I was at BEO. But it was really galling because we had been saying this for decades. And I have to say, it was only when a middle-class white woman was killed that people took notice. And there's something really, really shaming about that. So we need to look back at what our experiences have been and what we can tell people. So I'm going to go from the sort of micro individual experiences to the macro in society, because I think we have to span this in order to tackle this. It's how we view the police. Most people in Black communities do not view the police as their protectors. If you think about anything, then think about how Doreen Lawrence and Neville Lawrence were treated. Their son had been murdered, and they were treated as suspects. They had the police informing on them. Can you imagine how awful that would be at the worst possible point in your life when you're going through the thing that no parent ever wants to go through. When we think about child Q, when we think about child X, and I was involved in that case, you know, a 13-year-old boy who was playing with a water pistol in the street with his friends, the squad, what are they called? Squat lot, the police, came because they'd reported that a black man was there with a pistol. 13-year-old boy with a water pistol. They floored him. This was in front of other children as well. And what that boy went through was absolutely appalling. He was treated as a criminal. The trauma that that boy and those children that saw that will live with them forever. So don't tell me that anybody's going to restore his trust in the police, because that's never going to happen. But when we think about women, we're not just thinking about women that come into direct contact. We're thinking about mothers of those children. We're thinking about people in the community who have witnessed this. We're thinking about young girls and young people who have witnessed this as well. So it's not just that direct contact. And it's also about that adultification of black children. And the Alliance for Police Accountability will be holding a conference on that very subject, because we have to look at how the police treat our black children. And I can't believe I'm actually having to say this. So we need to take it right back down to how police are treating children. And that's a shameful thing to say. We know that this is really about inequality. When we think about economic violence, when we think about the combination of we are the poster child for inequality, you know, I think we're beaten only by the US. We are the 5th or 6th richest economy in the OECD, and we have children that are going to school with no lunch. We have children and we have young people who don't feel that there is any future for them, who are going to get involved with crime because they know they're not going to get a nice job and have a nice house and live a nice life and have a pension and blah, 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 all of these things, because of racism, because of a lack of education, because of a lack of health, all of these things. We know that in a country with high levels of economic inequality, we also have higher levels of we have lower levels of educational attainment, but we also have higher levels of crime, we have higher levels of incarceration, we have higher levels of mental poor health, and higher levels of drug and alcohol addiction. So really, this is tweaking at the edges. When we think about how we would reform, well, how we would restore trust, I'm not thinking about how we restore trust in the police, because I think that ship has sailed. In fact, I think it's at Harland and Wolff, if that still exists, in the knackers yard being broken up into small pieces. What we really need to think about is how we create a society where we don't need this model of policing, where we have more equality in society and we have lower levels of crime and we have more respect, because this is also what inequality does. It makes people stump down. And when the ladders of inequality are so far apart, you know you've got farther to fall, and you know it's much harder to get up that rung. So we are constantly in a society that is seeking to blame someone else for their problems, because we know they're but for the grace of God go us. So I think really, you know, I'm not even going with restore trust, I'm sorry. I always do this, come along to an event and go, no, that's totally not, I'm not having that at all, not even going for that benchmark. But I think we also have to ask, what attracts a disproportionate amount of racists, sexists, homophobes, transphobes into the police? And I think that is one of the biggest questions we have to, because we know they're not just bad apples. We know this is about the system, it's about what's allowed to happen, it's about that lack of accountability that you're talking about, because this is a protection system. And I think I just want to end really by saying we can't let them mark their own homework. We just can't. And we have to remember that in this country, in theory, we are supposed to have policing by consent. And I can say for most of our communities, I think there is no consent there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And on a different occasion, we're going to talk about your original, your original thesis. I've been stuck on witchcraft issues since my time in Australian politics. I was routinely called a witch, and then there was a There was a radio shock jock who suggested I should be put in a bag and taken out to sea to drown, enabling me to deliver the line, "Didn't anybody ever tell him you can't drown a witch?" But perhaps if we could just keep the witch theme going for one quick swing across the panel. If you could cast a spell and make the government after the election, whoever that is, the government after the election do one thing that would make a difference, what would it be? What's the one thing you definitely...
So many things, but I would say the data. Good, robust data that's transparent, because how can you start anywhere without that?
What would you say? One thing?
I would say, as I did as leader of the Equality Trust for 5 years, focus on cross-departmental strategy to reduce inequality.
One thing?
Well, they could just end the hostile environment.
Louise?
I would probably say that I think that the government needs to seriously, if they're serious about violence against women and girls and boys as well, they need to get much better. I'll take prevention, but right now I'll take catching more of them and making sure that they are held to account for those crimes. And we have a model that works, which is Operation Soteria, and it should be mandatory, not optional. And that would literally, in a short period of time, transform. At the moment, let's take rape. You are, if you rape a woman, you are, I think it's 81%, or it could be 91. Our attrition rate for rape in London is 9%, which means 91% of people, potentially alleged rapists, walk away. So I would like to change that. I would make that a symbol of whether I am serious about violence against women and girls, which is after murder. That is our top crime. And we could do a much better job just by being better at it. And I'd probably start there.
Thank you. Well, all great ideas. Thank goodness no one asked for tens of billions of pounds of a green economy package. I'm going to go out now for some questions. Do we have...
It involve money, though.
Yes, yes, restoring trust definitely does. Well, we've got lots of questions, so we're going to have to do... We've got kind of a few here, so yes, you on the end, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I just wanted to ask Baroness Casey, if possible. Tomorrow, I think the HMIC Inspectorate are due to release their new latest inspection on the Metropolitan Police's handling of child sex exploitation, and I think it's widely expected to be pretty awful. And I just wondered how you felt the Met have reacted in the years since your report.
Okay, so I'm not aware of the detail of the latest report. I am avoiding as best as I can marking the Metropolitan Police's homework after a year. I think that they need longer in order to get going on it. But if I were to, I would probably say not good enough, try harder. And what frustrates me is that on some things we know that we could do a better job. There are some things that are really hard to fix, genuinely hard to fix. Poverty, we could do a better job of that. But there are some things that are really hard to fix. A police service doing a more effective job to tackle child abuse is not as hard to fix. It's doable. And if we've got officers refer to being put on child abuse as a punishment post, we're in a bad place. And I'm just not. I think that the multiple initiatives and the people think, right, we're in a hole, Casey's done this, we need to do 1,000 things. And I think it will take them longer and greater focus.
Thank you. I think there was a question next to you. Yes.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you so much for everything you're doing. It's absolutely super work, all of you. And it's actually very emotional your way you've spoken this evening. It's very touching, the work and the commitment that you all put into it. So sincere thank you. Along the witches line, I confirm I've arrived on my broomstick, and I'm going to ask, this is specifically for Louise. From what you've said, it's such a desperate situation. Who is advocating for a different service, an alternative service to the police? Because I've run big business and you don't keep funding something that's broken. So who is advocating for it and where is it in the production line?
So I think that, we're in an election year, and obviously I think that's a time of potential great change, and I am hopeful for big change, even if we're not the beneficiaries of the 28 billion that they're not going to spend on green. They now might spend. I'm only joking. I know we have to do that. But I think that where I get hope out of this is that there was a time when we were better at policing, and it isn't that long ago, right? I'm not saying it was perfect, but there was a time that in my own bit of London, which is very multicultural and very, very poor, and has got worse, not better, where we had a neighbourhood policing team. It was quite big. We had a sergeant, we had 3 police officers, we had PCSOs. There was a specialist, they were called Sapphire, rape team. There was a specialist team for dealing with child abuse, and the attrition rate, to use criminal lingo, was 16% was rape in London. It's not great, but given some of the trickiness around that, but it's now 9. And so I think that I am more hopeful than I probably sound, in that I just think some of these things could be changed. And I did make a recommendation, I don't think it was I can't remember if it was in the report or not, but I do feel that one of the things we could carve out is to bring in women's safety units run by women and staffed by many others, not just women. And I think that there has to be some fresh thinking, a bit like your idea in the community, which when you talked about it, I was thinking, why did nobody think of that before? It's like so blindingly obvious at some level, yet nobody does it. And sometimes it takes somebody to come along and do something, the same way Operation Soteria has come along and done something, which gives me real hope. And so, thank you for flying in on your broom, but don't give up hope, because we can do some of this stuff, and we can do it within a term, a parliamentary term. If people want to fix these things, it doesn't have to take years, it could take months and short years. And I really believe that, and I specifically believe it if we're talking about the criminal justice system in relation to violence against women and children. That is not beyond our wit. Structural racism, overall inequality in life, much tougher, equally important, and the subset is exactly as you've described. But we can fix some of this stuff. I feel very passionately about, not just passionately, evidence tells me it's fixable.
And there was a hand just behind. Yes, just here. And then we'll take the hand there and then we'll swing over to the other side of the room.
Thank you very much. And apologies for the 3rd question in a row, but it's for you again, Baroness Casey. I was very interested in the reaction to your report, and particularly from Mark Rowley in terms of his reluctance to accept your labels of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. And I wondered if you could just explain your feelings around that, and particularly whether you thought how and whether there was any political pressure placed on him in terms of that reluctance.
Okay, so the starting point is the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police is probably the most powerful public servant in the country and is eventually signed off by the Queen and then the King. Political pressure is not an excuse. So that's my starting point. And if you're not man enough, to use their language, to deal with those sorts of issues, don't take the job. And don't run behind the skirts of Suella Braverman and say, she told me to say it. It doesn't work for me. That doesn't wash. I didn't say that quite that publicly, but there are a few noises off around the edges, just to cover myself, Julia, in case, you know, all of this is on tape and will be taken down and used in evidence against me. So, so I think I think that it was, just speaking sort of politically and sort of communicating, such a stupid thing to do. Because apart from disrespecting Londoners, which is actually a more serious reason that he should have accepted that word. You know, I've often wondered, and I said this publicly earlier today, so I'll say it again, if I'd said the Metropolitan Police is institutionally, structurally, systemic organisation, I gave them all the words. I didn't just pick one. I said whichever way you look at it, the organisation, the infrastructure, the structures, you know, and we proved it beyond all reasonable doubt and some using evidence. I've thought to myself occasionally, and dare I say this out loud, that if we'd said it was instituting misogynist and bullying and homophobia, but not found it racist, would they have accepted that? And I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just putting it out there because I think the race issue is so deep, and we've known about it for so long, and nothing has shifted on it. And I think partly my personal upset about it is I am a white privileged woman. I'm now in the House of Lords, and I'm listened to, but the cavernous pain of black people in London clearly are not. And I find that quite hard on a personal level. So if there's anything personal about it, it's that. I think it was tactically stupid, and I think it meant that the whole thing turned into the is it or isn't it. We were back in isn't it or isn't it, as opposed to clearly it is. The evidence is absolutely clear in every line and every page. And I gave them a get out of jail card, sorry to use your word, but basically I've put 4 tests. And because they wanted an argument over institutional, everybody doesn't realise there's a way. So I understand if I'm labelled something and I want to change that label, I need a route map to do something about that, or else I'll always be called it. And I understand some of that fear in that organisation and in policing more generally. They're worried that if they admit it, then somehow we'll never get rid of that label. And you think, well, it's not a label, it's an evidence description of what your organisation is. But let's just pop that to one side, sir. Normally men. And I've got a chip on my shoulder tonight. I've had a bad day on that front. It's called post-feminism, gentlemen. I'm allowed to do it for fucking decades now. And just to get a little bit even Stevens, and you're not allowed to say a word. But anyway, just let me get that off my chest. But I thought it was really interesting, instead of concentrating on the route map out, so we've got 4 really clear tests. There's evidence in their organisations and in MOPA about how they could measure their difference. And yet, instead of that, we entered it. What we didn't, therefore, surface is the fact that the police have withdrawn from Londoners, that they dismantled the service to women and children. Dismantled is the right word for it. That essentially they they took all the civilians. So we're all watching CSI thinking that happens. Does it? Hell. And they genuinely had broken fridges that I think they were more worried about than anything else. And so yes, it's therapy, which I shall stop, Rosie, because you're looking at me now, so I ought to shut up. But I feel. What do I feel about it? I feel that Londoners and London are bigger. And in time, I've worked for 5 prime ministers. Eventually, the people have it and we have it out. And that's what politicians need to remember, is at the end of the day, we can have our way here. And I'm just disappointed that Mark didn't call it when he could have done. It was a missed opportunity. He could have been the first commissioner after 50 years post the 70 years post the Windrush. Whatever it is, I was in the 80s in Brixton, I was living there after those riots. He could have been the one that called it and said, we accept this and we move on, and he's missed that opportunity. Doesn't mean to say that it's ever too late, and doesn't mean to say that they can't work on the 4 tests and prove to us that they can meet those 4 tests and change their organisation. It's never too late.
Just a contribution in answer to the same question, then I'm going to come here and quickly take some questions on the other side, otherwise we'll have an imbalance in the room. Yes?
It's just a very quick point on the lack of admission of institutional or systemic racism. And I think it's because people are still stuck in this idea that racism is, somebody calling me the N-word. That it implies then that everybody in the force is going around saying all sorts of things and beating up black people and blah, blah, blah. I'm not being glib about this. They may be. But I think it's that lack of understanding of what systemic and institutional racism is, that it is that difference in treatment between a white woman who's murdered and black women who are murdered. So I think until we have people actually understand what systemic and institutional racism actually means, then we will be stuck with individuals saying, oh, no, I'm not racist. I don't, go around calling my neighbours names, because people just don't understand what that term means.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, please.
I think Wanda's partly answered my question, because my question was going to be more a philosophical one. How can there be the restoration of trust if there is no full admission and recognition within the police and justice system that they are institutionally racist, sexist, misogynistic, and homophobic? And until they do that, how can there be any hope of trust?
I think we're going to take that as a sort of summary of the panel. Thank you for that. And there's one question here. Are there any other questions? I'm finding, if you're in the back, it's sort of hard to see because the dark's against you. But yes, please, or the light's in my eyes, rather, making you look like
Thank
you're
you,
in the dark.
Julia. This question really is for everybody, particularly Louise, though. Something I found interesting was when Nazir Afwal, who was involved in the so-called the Asian sex grooming groups. He left London, he found it a bit more freedom, and he was sitting in on one of the Manchester Met, if I've got my facts right. And they were putting the targets they had to meet that year. And the first target was terrorism. The next one was GBH, burglary, and guess what was at the bottom? DV. And he said to them, you will find that if you go into the houses where DV is occurring, that's where you'll find your terrorists, and your rates will go up. That's how they got Al Capone, through tax, not through crime. It's kind of, looking at it from another way, coming at it from another way, and I just found that really interesting.
Okay. Louise, do you want to start?
So obviously, as liberal as I can muster, I do believe in rehabilitation. I'm smiling, I'm laughing. Come on, it's no, you're not even. You're really serious. Okay, but I quite like getting criminals. Let's put it that way, particularly if they're violent to women or children. So I do believe in the. I think he's right up to a point. I wouldn't say you could take all those 4 categories and suggest that you find your way in there. But certainly, I think, let's switch to another area of public policy. Having had 2 big goes under different prime ministers at dealing with families with multiple needs, or troubled families, depends which administration, whether they're blue or red, and who you're working for, what you call them. One of the most striking things about those families was I think it was 52% of the families that had a police call out within the preceding 6 months, which for criminologists that's pretty high. And the levels of domestic violence which were uncovered because of their connection with their family intervention worker, and it wasn't uncovered before, was 8 out of 10. And so I think what you start to see in the patterns of families with multiple needs, or actually women who would largely, God love them, I hope, are in your Hope Street project, because they will be, I would imagine, in that category, is you'll definitely see overlaps. And I think the point that Nazir and I feel quite strongly about is if you're going to look at violence, you might start with domestic violence. And if we looked at violence and violent crime and just started with what happens behind closed doors and all of that, we would get higher attrition rates. But we do have some experts in the room that know more about this than I do. But yeah, he's got a point about, I think DV is a real indicator of other issues, and we can catch some nasty people.
Yeah, and I would say on that, I think, talking about the topic of violence, we can be quite crime specific because, of course, police have to follow the law and try and implement the law, which kind of then takes the topic of violence out of it in a way. So I think there's something interesting about that and the study of violence. And I think then particularly when we come back to male violence versus female violence. And again, if you're going to come up with intelligent solutions, I wonder if instead they went after the specific crime as written down in the Houses of Parliament, maybe there'd be a more sort of interesting outcome there. But certainly with domestic violence in Hampshire, I spend a lot of time with Hampshire Police, obviously, and it is their number one. That is their bread and butter all day, every day, it's domestic violence. But then do we have the data? Not really. Do we see the money coming into domestic violence like it goes into anti-terrorism? No, we don't.
I just think you just need to be a bit careful, though. And Nazir, after I tend to have disagreements with, I think him saying, and I'm hoping I'm reading this right, because I didn't hear everything you said, was that if he said, if you look at domestic violence, that's where you will find your terrorists. But if you look at Muslim communities or minority communities, that would be stereotypical, stereotyping those communities. And I think sometimes when he's talking about honor-based violence, and this has happened in honor-based violence, you say, well, if you look at where all the black minority communities live, that's where you will get your terrorists or your killers. And I think that we've got to be careful about not, stereotyping those communities. Yeah, it's.
I mean, he was a person who was able to jump the races. Everybody in the police was saying that this is a racist thing, we can't touch it. And I'm not saying
Yeah, I mean, he does confront racism, and he does deal with the under-policing issues as well. So he has some very good points that he does make. But I also have my differences about how you argue for this.
Mm-hmm. So we're at time. I'm just going to bring us to an end, but I'm going to do it by inviting the panellists just to offer one quick last thought, and then I will be asking you to thank our panellists who've done a remarkable job. Louise, one quick last thought.
Don't lose hope.
Don't lose hope.
Don't lose hope.
Like that one.
Keep battling.
Well, I like the police force to adopt human rights standards and understand intersectionality.
Mm-hmm. One last thought.
Far more work on intersectionality, bringing different people together, because we have our spaces, our rarefied spaces, our campaigning spaces, and we just don't bring them together enough.
Edwina?
If you can't change the system, then build your own system.
Well done. A very good line. Well, thank you very much to everybody for joining tonight. Thank you to Political Quarterly for being this co-host, and to Johnny and the team there. And thank you so much to Caitlin and the team that's worked with her on the presentation that you saw at the start. It's a down payment on the building of this broader gender equality index. It's an incredible amount of work, but it's going to be, I think, a remarkable data set for us to use. So thank you to Caitlin for all of that work. Thank you. And safe journey home to all. Should I just check? Let me just do it.
Wine if it's raining.
There is wine outside. I think Adelaide 29 degrees. Just saying. Thank you very much. Good night.